Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is a sting. I'm told that it's time for us to start. Thank you very much for coming, those of you in the room. And I think there are quite a few people online for what I hope will be a worthwhile discussion over the course of the next hour to answer the question on the screen. Are we chasing cure over care in Alzheimer's? And also to drill down a little bit to the state of play on cure. The race for drugs for Alzheimer's is a high-stakes affair, billions spent, and some quite significant recent developments, which I hope we can talk about. And perhaps we can end up by nudging the government along to produce a long-awaited strategy. Housekeeping. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and this is a ThinkIn. So for anyone who's not been to one before, the overriding priority is that everybody who wants to say anything, please do, however you like. Interrupt in any way you like, and that way, by the end of the hour, we'll all be wiser. Don't wait until the end, because then there just won't be time. My colleague James tends to create more time at the end of the hour, but it doesn't exist. That's fake. That's fake time. I wanted to start just as a sort of warmer-upper and to confirm that everyone can hear me online. Raise your hand physically if you're in the room, and electronically if you know how online. There's a, I'm not looking at it now because I haven't got a screen in front of me, but there is a tab. Phoebe, you're going to explain to people just in case they don't know how.
There's a reactions tab.
Reactions tab. Hover over the reactions tab. So raise your hand if you have had experience of living with / caring for someone with dementia. Blimey. That is, I would say, a good 2/3 of the people in the room. And what does it look like?
About half.
About half the people online. Would anyone in the room like briefly, Matt, I saw you raised your hand, to describe what that's been like for you?
It was a couple of years ago, and it was my gran, and I think, to be honest, most of the time I had a harder time dealing with my dad, who mum it was, than my gran, because for me it was quite funny. Like, my gran was reminiscing about memories from when she was 20, regularly mistaking me for a boyfriend she had when she was 20, flirting with me. And although that was weird, it was, you know, an insight into my gran I never had. Whereas my dad took it a lot more personally. And I think dealing with my parent was much harder than dealing with my gran who had dementia. The sort of day-to-day caring was exhausting. And I think repeating the conversation and laughing at the same joke several times, exhausting. But I think I had a lot less harder time compared to most of my family members.
Anybody else with a burning impression of what it's like, who wants to seize the moment right now before we come to our invited guests? I suppose you can't tell from online whether a raised electronic hand is actually waving at you.
No, there's Sarah Wilcox raised her hand.
We'll definitely come to Sarah.
Yeah, we'll come to Sarah later. The hands have gone down again. So
Okay, difficult to see. Oh, well, look, let me just say that personally, I have not. And so one of the things that I tried to do this afternoon was to try to clarify in my own mind why this matters so much for everyone, why it touches on everyone. We're joined by Fiona Carragher. Let me get this right. Director of Research and Influence at Alzheimer's Society.
Yeah, that's it, thank you.
And someone whose reputation precedes him, so Tony Robinson, star of Blackadder, Time Team, and what was the one in the middle?
Maid Marian and Her Merry Men.
Maid Marian and Her Merry Men.
Yesterday was Pancake Day. Yes, it's Pancake Day.
We all define ourselves by which of those we know best. I'm a Blackadder person. So I just want to see what you make of my analysis of why this matters so much to all of us. It's about 9 months since the government promised a 10-year strategy for dementia, and it's about a week, by the way, since Bruce Willis was diagnosed with a particular kind of dementia. But more particularly, it's another day in the life of about 900,000 people in this country alone who live with dementia. And it's also another day in the life of a sort of rolling NHS crisis of staffing, funding, and capacity, much of which is attributable to hospitals overwhelmed by elderly patients with chronic conditions, many of whom cannot be discharged into care precisely because what they actually need is specialist care for dementia. And that is why the dementia crisis affects us all, even if we have not had personal experience of caring for someone with dementia. Have I got that broadly right in terms of how that affects us all?
I think that's about right. So just about 900,000 people at the moment. That number's set to rise to 1.4 million by 2040. So we know there's going to be more dementia in the future. And when you think about carers and family members around, I mean, your story is so typical. Your parents dealing and supporting your grandmother, but actually the wider family as well, and how that kind of it impacts the wider community is significant, and that number will rise into the future. And you're right, it's an NHS issue, but it's also a care issue, and I'm sure that we'll come on to that. But there's also some hidden issues that we might come on to. Yeah. For example, the number of unpaid carers that there are is nearly 1 million in this country, which means that many of them are economically having to step out of the workplace to care for their loved ones. And again, when you think about the broader piece about the economy and all what we're hearing about needing to get people into work, there is a bigger economic argument to be made here as well.
Right. Tony, you were one of those unpaid carers. Is that the main reason that you have sort of accepted the invitation to be a spokesperson for this?
Most of my experience is about 15 or 20 years ago. But I think the emotional experiences I had then were very, very similar to what unpaid carers feel today. Those feelings of worthlessness, guilt because you feel so angry so much of the time with the person who has the Alzheimer's, loss because you feel that you've sacrificed your life for someone you love, but they've kind of disappeared on you anyway. Tiredness, because there is so little respite, and at the moment, as we all know, the few respite facilities that there were available, an awful lot of those closed down during COVID and haven't come back again. So even if you were lucky enough to be one of those carers who was able to get a little respite care, a lot of that has gone. So when I think of Alzheimer's, I think of tiredness, of uselessness, of desperation, because there doesn't seem to be a solution. It all feels absolutely ghastly. And I think one of the problems, and we were just talking about this in the room beforehand, is that because it seems so ghastly, it has been very difficult to pitch any kind of uplifting vision about how we might be able to engage with infirm elderly people in the future. And there are now those first glimmerings of hope.
Right.
And I think we've got to seize on those and use those as a springboard for what we can do in the future. Because let's be honest, all the Tories are going to be able to manage over the next 2 years is some kind of managed decline, both in the NHS and in the care sector. However much we might want there to be more than that, there just ain't going to be. The upside of that seems to me that there is the possibility that all of us over the next 18 months can kind of pull together to decide what our arguments are, what our priorities are, and what the vision can be for the future, so we can solve the issues and not have to think in those kind of binary terms. I mean,
Right.
you apologised for the question at the beginning, and I think you were quite right in apologising for it. But underlying it, there is this big question, which is, what is our vision for the future? And that's what I hope that we might be able to tease out this evening.
Well, let's talk a bit first then about what you call the glimmer of hope. Fiona, do you want to bring us up to date on lecanemab? Am I pronouncing it right?
Yep, lecanemab.
And its significance, and the kind of, it feels like a hockey stick to me, because it's a story that was in a sort of downward glide slope of rather depressing news stories, and then suddenly there was an uptick at the end of last year.
Yeah. So I'll talk about lecanemab, but I do want to say that this is one part of the whole vision that I think that we need. So
Right.
we can maybe come on to some of the other things that need to
exactly, yeah.
change. Yeah. So lecanemab is the first drug that's just been approved by the FDA in the US that will slow cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease. And there's a few caveats to that. I think just to, I suppose, a little bit of science, that dementia describes the symptoms, and there's lots of diseases that can cause dementia. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common, but frontotemporal dementia that Bruce Willis has just been diagnosed with is another. Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia are the kind of most common. And lecanemab targets Alzheimer's disease, and it needs to target those that are diagnosed early and with a particular biomarker that you can see in your blood or in your spinal fluid. So it is exciting because, as you said, for a very long time we've been waiting for a drug. It's not a cure, but waiting for a drug which we would call disease modifying, one that will slow progression of Alzheimer's disease. And what it does is it targets the amyloid protein, which is the abnormal protein in the brain that causes a lot of the symptoms. So essentially it removes the amyloid, but there's a lot of complexity around how we diagnose and how we give that drug. So although it's had FDA approval, we're probably a couple of years from this being routine practice for that small number of people with an early diagnosis with the diagnostic tests that say they're ready for this drug. But it'll probably be a couple of years before we see it in the NHS and in the clinics.
And I think I'm right in saying that at the same time as that looks like it's going to come online fairly soon, there are a number of other drugs which deal with anxiety and confusion and all of the things which, as you say, aren't going to cure the disease. But boy, oh boy, are they going to help with all those millions of unpaid carers who have to suffer from all that tension that they're surrounded by for so much of the day.
So I'm a scientist, and I have to say that my thinking around dementia is that in some ways it's no surprise that it is the last big kind of set of clinical conditions that we're going to tackle through science and research, because they are the most complex of diseases in the most complex organ, the brain. So in some ways it kind of makes sense. It's the last big set that we're looking at. But you're right, not only lecanemab, but we've got 2 or 3 other drugs coming through in the next 6 months through the regulatory process, and hundreds of clinical trials globally looking not just at these drugs that disease modify, so change the progression of the disease, but also targeting the really important symptoms, agitation, sleeplessness, that are things actually that cause most crisis in families and how they're coping with them. So there is hope on the horizon, but it is absolutely not a cure and it's not a panacea, and we need to think holistically about tackling this problem.
Yeah, and it doesn't address any of the care issues which are so
What percentage
powerful.
of people...
Tell us your name, sorry.
Sorry, hi.
No, that's fine. And yeah, use the
Hello,
mic.
my name is Nadia. Very interesting subject, thank you.
Go ahead.
What percentage of people suffer from the condition that's tractable to treatment with lecanemab? I mean, I'm wondering how large a population of people in the overall population of dementia sufferers will be helped by this drug?
It's going to be about 2%, very small
It
amount.
sounded like it's
Yeah, it's a small number. But I think how I would describe it is that it is the hope coming over the horizon. This is the first of others coming through, and the fact that we've got the first drug approved by FDA shows us that actually we can start to tackle this. There's a lot more coming, and a lot more investment that has gone in, which means we're starting to think about not just amyloid, but other things that we know are probably going to be important in this complex set of diseases, be it your metabolism, be it your hormones, be it your genetics. So there's lots of other ways that we're starting to think about and tackling what is this complex set of diseases.
Thank you.
So, yes, go ahead.
Question online that might be
Yeah, please do.
relevant. That's okay. So, Nina, if it's okay, I'm gonna read it out because you've worded it very well. So about the kind of screening process, she said her mother was resistant to being diagnosed for a long time after we suspected dementia, and she would have had symptoms even before that, disguised as other manifestations, kind of hearing decline and other things. So like how much that's a part of kind of treating at early stage.
It is a huge part of it, which is why I don't like this reductionist cure versus care, because we're going to have to tackle this on multiple fronts. One of the big challenges around dementia is the stigma associated with it. People are really scared, you know, when they start to have memory loss, and, you know, knowing whether they should take that first step to kind of get a diagnosis. We also know that some healthcare professionals don't think there's much point in getting a diagnosis. So there's that step before we even get into the kind of the issues in the NHS, which I'm sure we'll come on to. So we did a big campaign at Alzheimer Society in last year's Dementia Action Week in May, called, it's not called Getting Old, it's called Getting Ill, to really encourage people working with the Royal College of General Practice to say these are the symptoms that actually you need to think about having a really good conversation with your primary caregiver. But she's absolutely right. A lot of people are really scared to do that, which is why it needs a much bigger societal conversation.
Seems to me it's not unlike the model of prostate cancer, which is one that I happen to have, which is like for years and years, there was this massive resistance by men to being examined rectally for obvious reasons. And there's been a great deal of success in turning that round, at least in certain parts of the population, in just 4 or 5 years, and we haven't really had that sort of resolute focus on it as far as Alzheimer's is concerned yet.
But neurological screening of large numbers of people is a huge undertaking, and I'm really struck by the difference between two things. The thing that you pointed out, Nadia, which is, or that we extracted, that this the utility of the direct utility of lecanemab will be as small as 2%. But what you were both saying before we started was that the broader implications of these new drugs coming on stream is going to be a huge reorientation of everything that the health service and social care does. So can you explain a little bit why the impact of drugs with apparently very specific applications is, in your view, going to need such a big reorganisation of the way we look after old people?
So if I take it, then you maybe come in, Tony. So part of the, if you want to get access to a drug like lecanemab, you need to have a diagnosis when you are symptomatic. So it's not screening, so it's not something that you do before you, so pre-symptomatically, before you've got memory issues or other kind of symptoms. But it is at that point that you're starting to worry about your memory, that you're going to your GP and you're having those conversations. You've noticed things are wrong, not just about your memory and others. But we will need you then to be referred into a specialist centre, and that specialist centre needs to be able to diagnose you accurately, and that means having access to things like PET-CT and other imaging technology, and we know that that's not there in all cases at the moment. We also know that to get this drug, it's done by an infusion. So this is like you would have for chemotherapy, it's done by an infusion. And to make sure there's no side effects in your brain, you have to have regular imaging done through your treatment process. So when you think about it, all of those steps, from stigma associated to knowing whether I should go to my GP, your GP then referring you without delay to the NHS, and the NHS centres, often in mental health units, the memory assessment clinics, having access to the very specialist diagnostic testing. I mean, that's just the first part of it. All of that needs to be looked at.
Can I ask another question? I'm curious because it seems to me that early stage dementia is extremely difficult to diagnose any neurological diseases, because it's easily confused with, for example, depression, social isolation, poor nutrition, dehydration, all kinds of things, which lifestyle changes might improve. So when you talk about a diagnostics process, which is already incredibly complex, you have to unpack all the other possible causes, don't you?
You do, and that's a really important role of primary care, of the general practitioner, because they have a role in saying, like, almost filtering through the people that have whether it's depression or whether it's other issues that can be treated within primary care. Their role is then to say which are the ones that we think potentially do have Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, and then refer them on for the more specialist tests. So you're right, some of this is a gatekeeping piece, but also, I mean, on all of those levels, there's things that we need to do to change the whole process.
Can I just continue on for what you were saying about when they're having the treatments, obviously then they've got to have regular scans. The drug itself, is that something that if an individual starts taking it, they're then taking it basically continually for how long? Is it a treatment course of a certain period of time, or is it you have to take that drug for basically the rest of your life if you want to, keep the disease at bay? Because obviously that actually lets you then start to understand the scale of what you're then talking about in terms of the facilities and everything that's needed to actually administer that drug to the individuals that can have it within the UK healthcare system.
Yeah, and that's all the work that needs to be done now. So kind of looking at how, because the trial data that's come out so far is for a set period of time that they've looked at. So exactly that, we need to now look at how long, what dose, for how long. So that is the next kind of big piece of work that will come through.
I think neither of us are saying that drug itself is the light at the end of the tunnel. And maybe my metaphor was wrong at the beginning. I think what we both feel is that maybe the HIV model works very well here, that for a long time it was like nothing worked. It felt like a brick wall. But then suddenly a few little fissures started to appear in that wall, which changed the way people thought, which changed the way that people wanted to invest. I mean, you were saying to me the other day that actually we talk about these billions of pounds that are going in to try and cure Alzheimer's, but that Big Pharma walked away from it because it seemed so intractable. But if we're beginning to see glimmers of hope, it's that we think might be something which could focus everyone very clearly, although we quite understand the issues that you said. I mean, I was thinking when you said what you said, neither of my parents ever got a diagnosis. You just didn't get one at all in those days. And the great thing about a diagnosis is at least you know in which direction you can start to bring the care to work.
And the diagnosis rates have really plummeted since COVID. So the most recent figures, like literally my team have been all over it in the last week, is just under 62% of people, based on prevalence, based on what we would expect, have a diagnosis of dementia. So 38% of people don't know. So I think that is extraordinary when we think about that in other contexts and other clinical diseases.
How do you explain that? Is it because COVID was such a catastrophe from the point of view, particularly of people with dementia in care homes, that those who suspect they have it or whose families suspect they have it just aren't going near the system?
I think we're trying to unpick it at the minute, but I think it's possibly some of that. I think partly that people have been, particularly during COVID, kind of reluctant to kind of go into their GP. We know that there's issues on getting a GP appointment, and then there's the backlogs that we have within the memory assessment clinics. The NHS have prioritised this. It's part of their operational plan that came out in England over the Christmas period. But we are a long way from where we were pre-COVID, which was sitting around 67, 68%. So it has dropped significantly. 67, 68% of those who had dementia had a formal diagnosis? Of those that we would expect to have
Right.
dementia based on prevalence have a diagnosis. Yeah.
Okay. In this,
Right, good.
okay, well, I've noted the hand raised at the back. In a second, I want to sort of come to defense of the question, which isn't really binary. It's about a balance. I put it to you, Your Honour. But first, Tony, just back to this question of the very big implications of some fairly specific medical advances. What's the business case that you would make to a health secretary, Tory or Labour, for this wholesale reorganisation of the health and social care system to take the best advantage of medical and technological advances?
Because the NHS can't work without it, and we've seen that, and we've seen it happening more and more and more. I think I'm right in saying that something like 25% of all beds in hospitals are occupied by people with dementia, and they.
So
they go in with dementia, they get made more ill because they're listless, or they get some secondary illness when they're in the hospital. Then they can't get out because there's nowhere to put them out. 25. So it's a problem about 25% of all the beds in the NHS. I mean, there are 1,000 other. You know, whenever you're trying to do something in the charitable sector, you try and justify it because it's going to save money or make lots of money. And there are hundreds of other examples of ways in which it would. But given how focused we are on the NHS at the moment, that seems to me to be absolutely colossal.
Right, and I'm not going to let either of you go before the end of the hour without setting out your versions of the strategy that the government needs to put in place to solve that 25% problem. But first, James.
I don't know whether this is the right time for this, Charles. I just wanted to go back to the point that Tony made right at the beginning about the strain on him and care, and you use these phrases about guilt and loss and uselessness and tiredness. And I'm just interested to know what you think would have helped. What would help in terms of, Fiona, you made the point about unpaid care and carers. What would have helped you? What would have helped in terms of people around you having time to help you? Some of those things I imagine are inevitable and emotional, and you couldn't never have stopped them. But what's a helpful, healthy system of care for the carers?
Goodness, there's so many of them. One that would have been very important to me is that when you do get professional help, even if it's someone just changing a nappy or calming someone down to them, you get the same person every week and they come regularly. Doesn't seem like much of an ask, does it? But I think for most people in the caring situation, it's a dream that from far, far away, you just never get that because of, well, you can imagine the reasons why that doesn't happen. Training both for yourself and training for the people who come to care, a specific diagnosis, because without a specific diagnosis, you don't really know what it is you're supposed to do to help that person. Respite, you just can't carry on with it all the time. Less bureaucracy. Somebody was saying to me the other day that we talk about full-time carers, but it's actually a part-time job just to manage the officialdom surrounding your loved one who has the dementia. Sorry, I could go on forever with it. That was a very good question. I'm sure all the people who are listening, each one would put their hand up and say, yeah, but what about this? What about that? They're all dreadful. Sorry.
No, this respite, how do we pronounce it?
Respite.
What were the facilities that did exist, but you say don't exist enough anymore?
I didn't know of any.
Okay.
But it was some
want?
time ago. A breather. A breather.
And in practice, that means someone to come in and do your caring for you so you can go to the pub?
Yes, that would be good, wouldn't it? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I remember actually, I was rehearsing in town. I was driving back to my mum's. My mum was looking after my dad. And I stopped off at a pub in Leytonstone for a half a pint. And I still remember to this day the guilt I felt about having stopped off, which seemed to betray both my mum, because she would have to care for dad for that much longer, my dad, who was alone and frightened, and my own dignity. A half a pint. So yeah, I'm a great advocate of giving people time off to go to the pub.
Charles.
Yes, Matt.
Sorry, just building on that, one of the things I really remember is towards the end of my grand's life, my whole family got together and discussed putting her in a care home because that was a privilege we could have. And one of the reasons they didn't was the guilt they felt about kicking her out of the house that she'd lived in for 30, 40 years and putting her in a home with strangers where they were caring for her. And it's, stigma is a word that's been used a lot tonight. I feel like that might be one of the biggest stigmas because the people who care, the unpaid carers are the children. And, when you see your parent be put in a home or be with someone else, I imagine the guilt you feel as that unpaid carer is huge. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but that feels like possibly one of the biggest barriers that's not spoken about.
Thanks, Matt. Bruce at the front and then Jane at the back. And are we busy online?
Yeah, there's lots of comments online.
Okay.
Just in a varied career, as an anthropologist, I spent some time living with people who were caring, and it was about the time when you were caring for your parents, about 15 years ago. And at the time, I was doing it to try and help a council develop something which was then called individual budgets. And it was this idea that you've spoken about, which is that the bureaucracy of care was opaque to people. You didn't understand what you could ask for. And interestingly, I've used that knowledge now with my own parents. So my dad just had a stroke, and I went straight in and got all the things he needed because I remembered the things that we sort of put together. And what we did is we turned the questionnaire around. We turned it into a thing that you could use. We used pictures. So even someone with quite serious mental health issues, not just dementia, could actually identify their needs in a way that was non-judgmental. So if you had problems going to the toilet, whatever it might be, you just pointed to the pictures of what they were, and you built your care package using pictures, not words. And we found we could do that with someone that was with significant sort of mental health issues all the way through to someone with dementia. And we tried to build that up. And the other thing that we saw within that was that what you said is that you wanted someone who came the same every week. And so what we were trying to do was say, actually, there were carers in the community who wanted to work in that way, but couldn't because they couldn't find you, right? So the other thing we put on that was a marketplace. And now two things kind of got in the way of that. One is a lot of private equity came in and took over the roles that you described and tried to make a lot of money out of that service. So it failed because they just moved people around. But what I've seen recently, there's something called Equal Care Co-op that's up in Yorkshire. They're trying to create it's community-based part-time carers, not full-time. They're not working for a big company. They're working locally and creating circles of care in the community. So they're building it village by village rather than trying to deliver it at county level or even at sort of NHS trust level. So this is about trying to put back the infrastructure. So it's not then put onto the families, but you get a family type response. And what's frustrating is that these stories, they're not what we hear about when we think about care. What we hear about is these big companies who can't make a profit out of it, apparently. Well, these are not-for-profit care circles. So they're taking over that role and taking that, but we've definitely got an economic effect here around care, which is that there's a sort of belief that it only works if it's profitable, right? But in reality, you can build a community of care without the profit motive that potentially is equally as effective, but no one's prepared to back that because there's a lot of money sitting behind that profit model of care, which is what gives you that experience.
Just to be clear, in that model, they've got to access resources somewhere, and the idea is they're channeled via the local authority, which...
Yeah, they're part of that procurement, but they're offering that one-to-one long-term relationship, not whoever you're going to get for 15 minutes that day and you don't know who it is.
I do want to get onto care as opposed to cure, how it's funded, who should fund it, and who should be responsible. I should just say, Gillian says in the chat, it's not just about going to the pub. It's about having time to go to the doctor, dentist, hairdresser, having no time even to get to the shops. Thank you. Jane.
Actually, the gentleman at the front really probably just answered my question, because if that was available, that would be amazing for everyone. My mother-in-law has dementia now, and like Matt, it's kind of like getting to the stage where do you or do you not put that person into a home, someone that you love, and we have care in place. But it seems that there are two extremes. There's a fear and terror of getting diagnosed, and then there's this point at which someone gets put into a care home, and there's this huge thing, like a bit in the middle, where if there wasn't so much stigma, maybe we could get to the point where we're all talking about our brains in the way we talk about our pregnancy brain or our menopause brain, or and what other things. I love that circle of care thing. I think it's amazing. If that was available in her area, and it could be a normal thing and not a frightening thing, then that would make such a difference. And also, those people would be less likely to decline so quickly, which again would help with resources, for instance, in the NHS, I think.
Thanks, Jane.
Should we go online just briefly, only because we've got some. Nina said she's could come up on chat. The only other point that I thought, hi Nina, hopefully we can get up on the screen, was this point that Victoria raised as well about the lack of awareness that support carers can get from the Care Act from 2014, and the fact that during the diagnosis pathway, carers are not necessarily informed of the rights they have for respite. They don't have this kind of thing, which I think speaks to your point, Nina. If you want to talk through, I thought your point about cross-disciplinary training in relation to your mother was really interesting, if you're okay to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. So my mum has Alzheimer's. She just a couple of weeks ago moved into permanent care, but she was very resistant to every suggestion that there was anything wrong with her. We're talking about the importance of finding out early, not just for these drugs, but also just things like improving your diet and changing your lifestyle. We missed an opportunity to see it early because she had a fall, she got a concussion, and she had a CT scan as a result of that. And the specialist said, oh, she's fine, her skull isn't broken, blah, blah. And by the way, there's some evidence of a past stroke. And we thought, well, that's news to us. She had no idea she had one. And I mentioned it to her GP, they had no record. So we just ignored it. And then 2 years later, when we finally started looking at the dementia diagnosis, the GP said, oh yes, well, Alzheimer's blocking your brain blood vessels can also look a lot like stroke. So if that person in A&E doing the CT scan had thought, oh, it's not a stroke, I wonder what else it might be, we might have been getting a diagnosis a couple of years earlier than we actually did.
And Nina, given the current state of things, what difference would a diagnosis 2 years earlier have made to her care?
I think she might have been able to stay at home a bit longer, because if she'd understood that there were things she could do to slow down the progression of it 2 years earlier, she might have had a bit more time enjoying her life at home, rather than now in the position where she can't look after herself and she needs assistance.
And just
I'm not a specialist, that's just my view.
Can I just,
yes, please do.
It strikes me that virtually all of the things that we've been saying, it kind of presupposes that the person with Alzheimer's is, as it were, the passive recipient of this illness. And I quite understand why, and I've been terribly guilty of it in the past. And it seems to me that an awful lot of that is to do with communication. We're actually very bad at being able to talk to people who have dementia or to listen to people with dementia. And University of Cardiff have done some fantastic work on that over the last 5 years. I know about this because they've made 3 animations, which I would recommend that any of you who are interested in this field have a look at. And I did the voicing for them. And they were really doing just that, teaching carers, both professional and non-professional, how best you can communicate with people with Alzheimer's and how you can understand what they're saying and understand their worries and anxieties.
But I wanted to pick up a bit. Nina's story, I mean, it resonates with what we hear at Alzheimer's Society day in, day out. And while the kind of glimmer of hope around drugs for the future, actually getting that diagnosis, we did a lot of work last year and found out that people are really pleased they have that diagnosis because they can start to have these conversations with their families. They can start to, rather than in crisis, find a residential care, which is often what happens. The story you told of someone being in hospital, then not being able to get out to their own home is quite a typical story. So for me, the diagnosis piece is just as equally important to understand what care can be made, and what you've described is as hopeful as a drug, actually, in terms of having that real personalised, community-based, enabling people to live in a community they call home and they want to be. But for me, the diagnosis piece is the first step of all of that, and tackling the stigma, tackling the conversation.
And in the absence of widespread funding and enabling of the kind of system that Bruce described, what we have is the nightmare that you were talking about before we started, that was depicted in the Panorama programme that you helped with for the BBC. What was the name of the couple? Bill and Joe.
Bill and Joe. You might remember the story of Bill and Joe, and Joe had dementia, and Bill was her husband and really beautifully caring for her, but was just on his knees, exactly as you were describing. This was on the run up to Christmas, couldn't find respite care for Joe. Eventually managed to get her a care home place that was right for her, and it took him a long time, and she died a few weeks later. So it's really heartbreaking, and that's a story that we hear pretty much every day.
And there's a very specific and, for me, enlightening line in the written version of that, which is when Bill points out that the system treats dementia entirely differently in terms of who cares and who pays than being ill in any other way. Specifically, that when you're ill, you go to hospital. When you're ill in any other way, you go to hospital. When you have dementia, you stay at home, and as of later this year, you or your family is liable for a cap of £86,000 worth of care. It's all free at the point of need in other conditions. That's a gulf, isn't it, between the way these dementia and other conditions are treated. Do you see that gulf being narrowed, bridged?
So the issue that we have currently is that whilst we talked, haven't we, about this diagnosis pathway being through the NHS, but once you get your diagnosis, the story that we hear is that from people with dementia is that, what do I do now? And when they need care, it's usually through the kind of social care system, either through your own payment and trying to find, like your family was, trying to find the right care for your loved one, or through accessing local authority care, either what we would call, so within your own home, someone coming in and helping you, or within kind of a residential care home. And there's issues on all of that within social care, and I'm sure we will come on to conversations around this, but we know that there's issues of cost, there's issues of access, so finding those right support around you, but also the quality when you get there, for it being the right personalised around what is progressive conditions. There are things that can work, and I think that's the really frustrating thing, is that when you get really good, high-quality, personalised care that enables someone to live the life that they've always lived, whether it's going for a pint or going to watch the football or going to the garden centre, whatever it is that you love doing in your community, there are really good examples of how that can be done. But it's not done everywhere, and we know we've got particularly an issue with our workforce that are underfunded, and we've got significant gaps in that workforce as well. So there's lots of elements and issues around the social care state that we are in at the moment.
Right. Let's hear from some more people in the room. We'll start with you and then come to you, sir.
Hi,
what's your name?
John.
Hi, John.
Hearing about kind of the relationships involved, and people talk about being family members and stepping in. And then also when you were mentioning about the kind of 62% who are being diagnosed and sort of the 38 who aren't, I'm just curious how many people have family systems around, or friends and family systems around for those with dementia versus those who might be totally on their own with it, because it feels like something that would be especially difficult to be on your own with. And I guess connected to that, in spotting the systems, do you need people around you to help you recognize that the symptoms are popping up versus something that might be more physical? So just curious to know if there's any kind of thinking around that, or how much that plays into it.
So I'll take the second question first. So in terms of symptoms, I mean, some of the things, we've talked a lot about memory, haven't we? But actually there's a lot of other symptoms around it. I'd really encourage you to, on our website, we've got a really good symptom checker that'll kind of give you some ideas around that bit as well. But it's interesting, it's often loved ones that will notice when you're repeating a question multiple times. It's grandchildren or your people around you that will notice it. To your first question, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head in terms of how many people who are on their own, either without a partner or without family. But when we think about our demographics, it's going to be more in the future. So it definitely is going to be a significant issue into the future, which is why this is going to have to be a societal conversation, a community conversation about what do we do for people who live within our communities as well.
How often are people who form that 25% of hospital bed occupiers, people who are staying there and not being discharged for precisely this reason, that they're essentially alone? Or do we not know? I
don't know if we know that actually. The figures are really tricky to get in terms of the kind of that kind of population. But we know the government has put additional money into, they're calling it a discharge scheme over the winter to try and get people out, trying to get care packages in place. But it's a sticking plaster, and what we need is a much more sustainable long-term vision for this, because actually, in our opinion, at Alzheimer Society, that's the wrong side. You're trying to fix it at the end of the problem. What you need to be doing is having really good care and support in place now in the community or within residential care, so that people are avoiding those admissions to hospital. So we know that many of the reasons that people with dementia will end up in hospital is a fall, or they've got a urinary tract infection, or they're dehydrated. And if you had really good, consistent care, when someone who knows you really well, is trained in dementia, comes in, a lot of that would be avoided. So the sticking plaster at the end is one thing, but we need to think about the whole system, about how we prevent that as well.
The additional money is not only a sticking plaster, it's a really bad sticking plaster as well, isn't it? Because if you think about it, you get the money to cope with the problem over Christmas, and then it runs out at the end of the tax year. So what does the local authority do? How does it build the people to look after people during those 3 months if the money is going to go away and you've got no idea whether it's going to come round the next Christmas or not? It's more, to me, it's just like someone standing up in Parliament and saying, "Oh, we've solved it. We've bunged 200 million at that problem." It's just nonsense.
So,
my name's Will. I work for the Archbishop of Canterbury and York's Commission on Reimagining Care. Tony, I couldn't agree more with you about the point about the need to reframe care and support away from people being passive recipients, but people who need to be enabled to do the things that they enjoy. And so even when we talk about how to fund the care and support system, I mean, we need to take a step back, I think, and think, what kind of care and support system do we want to fund, and what are the values that underpin that? And I suppose my question is, how do we reframe the narrative around this so that we think about demonstrating that the voice, amplifying the voice of people who have dementia, and demonstrating that they're the same as everybody else, that they have the same needs and hopes and aspirations for their lives.
The big problem, I'm just banging on about this all the time, bored you silly over the last couple of days with this. The big problem, it seems to me, is the parliamentary cycle, is the fact that virtually every new government has been campaigning during the elections to do more for older people and Alzheimer's people in particular. Why do they do that? Well, because they're a voting demographic, aren't they? But I believe that they want to do that. And then when they come into office, obviously it's not the first thing they want to do because they've got all the sort of shiny things that any new government will want to do. So it's probably around about 18 months to 2 years before they get down to fixing social care and fixing Alzheimer's. And then they start developing a plan for that, and it will probably take round about 2 years, won't it, in order to get that plan going, by which time they're running up to the next election again. And honestly, since my mum and dad had Alzheimer's, obviously that's been at the forefront of my mind an awful lot of that time. And I've seen that cycle time after time again. Labour governments just as much as Tory governments. And now we have this absurd situation of a very good chair of the select committee on this stuff, now becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer. When he was chair, he was advocating that we get 7 billion quid, and what have we got? Something like £500 million. So what we've got to find a way of cutting through that 5-year cycle, I think, before we can begin to get transformation of the kind which we absolutely need. And to me, what that's about is narrative. It's about ideology. We've done it in my lifetime as far as the environment was concerned. You know, when I was a kid, we would nick birds' eggs all the time. We would go into Epping Forest and light a bush and just wait there till the fire engine came because it was exciting. I mean, kids may do that. Kids may do that nowadays. I don't know, but at least they would know that what they were doing was, as it were, wrong. Every business factors in the environmental costs just because there have been key people strategically finding ways to make opinion and make us understand that the environment is a long-term job that needs fixing. And we have failed to do that as far as Alzheimer's is concerned. And that's why I genuinely feel that these next 18 months are crucial. I know that you've got that commission going. I think there's about 4 or 5 commissions going. And one could, laugh about that, except actually that's rather good. If the Fabians are doing that as well at the same time, another little pocket, the Times are doing it, aren't they? They've got, if all these people are doing it, and if they can come roughly to the same conclusions pretty damn quickly about the vision for the future, then I think we've got a fighting chance. But just waiting for the next government, whatever shade of politics it's got, is not going to do it.
But can I pick up on your point about hopeful narrative? Because I think that is really important. And I think that a lot of the hopeful narrative has been on the cure side, particularly in the media. But actually, when you really hear about what good care can look like and what good care can do, and hear that from people, in our case, from people with dementia, but obviously social care is wider than that. It's for working age adults, with other issues as well. That, I think, there's a real opportunity to change. But I agree with you. I think at the moment we are very much stuck in a political cycle, and it's we did think that we got some good breakthroughs. We had the social care. We had Boris standing on the steps of Downing Street at the beginning of his tenure. We had the white paper on social care reform. There was real hope. Just over a year ago that this was going to come through, and look where we are because of what's happened politically. So I think you're right, Tony. There's something about trying to, change that, break that from political cycle to a much more societal vision for the future.
Yes, James.
Just a really practical thing. Where we're sitting now is normally where the desks of the Tortoise audio teams, people like Matt and Jasper and a whole bunch of other people that we essentially kidnapped en masse from the BBC. and we had a visit, Jasper and I, sitting next to Matt, had a visit a couple of weeks ago from a guy called Mario Calabresi in Italy, where they've got something similar to Tortoise, an outfit called Cora. And what they've done with Italian hospitals is try to build podcasts, audio services for people with particular illnesses. Mostly they've worked with oncology units, because what they said the hospitals do there is that they find that patients go in, have the meeting with a consultant or a doctor, and then are so kind of frightened and shocked that by the time they get back to the car park, they've got 50 questions, but they're almost always the same 50 questions. And so what they've tried to create is a service where all of those questions can be answered and they're accessible, they're interactively accessible. And just listening to you both, particularly you, Tony, I just didn't know whether or not there's a way that, is there something that we could do that either, I'm really alive to your point about the dignity of the individual who's got Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, are there things that we could helpfully build that would be a way of informing people with dementia of what they're experiencing in a way that wasn't frightening, but given the repetition of those questions might be helpful in answering? And is there a way that we could be providing that kind of support to carers, or is that just a stretch too far? It's unlikely someone's going to sort of switch on a podcast and, you know, in the midst of all of that exhaustion, you know, dreaming of half a pint in Leytonstone, thinks I'm going to go for a podcast. Is there something like that, or is there something useful we could do on that front?
So Alzheimer's Society, we're really keen to talk to you about that, because we have dementia advisors. So these are the people who, can help you navigate this. One of the crisis points is getting that diagnosis and coming to terms with it. So we have dementia advisors across the country to do that. But we know that people access information in different ways. So I think the podcasting would be really interesting, and would be keen to take that offline with you. It'd be great.
It's interesting that you should have come up with talking about technological solutions, because I think you would agree that there is a role that technology can play in helping with certainly safer management, like an alarm when the gas is on. Do any of you do that? I'm doing that all the time nowadays. Whether someone's fallen out of bed, whether the door's locked, whether someone has gone out and left the door open. And there are some diagnostic things, aren't there, that can be done automatically. And I know some of the telecoms companies have already started moving into in that direction.
I think technology will play a role in sort of supporting, but it's never going to take the place of, a loved one or a carer in that place. Interestingly, we've just launched a global prize, the Modern Longitude Prize. So for those that love history, you will know that the Longitude Prize was about finding a way of navigating by longitude. We're working with the government, actually, Innovate UK, and partners across the world to get entrepreneurs and tech people to come and work in this dementia space. What new technology can help people to live well and independently in their own home. And we closed the call last week, and we've had 175 teams from 25 countries.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. So we'd love to kind of share that with you, but technology plays a role.
Say that Japan has done a huge amount of work in this area. Did you get any applicants? The Japanese have been working in this area for a long time, not surprisingly, because their population is probably as aged as any other in the world, probably. They're the leaders in an aging population, and they've developed all kinds of new technology for managing the health of elderly people. Have you seen any applicants from that?
Yes, we've had applicants from quite a few Asian countries, but the US and Canada, and interestingly quite a few from South America as well, which I think is quite. But dementia is a global problem. This is not just a first world problem. It is a global problem, and it's an increasingly global issue that all countries are going to have to get to grips with.
I had a sort of umbrella question. It's a bit contentious. Do you think that one of the difficulties in addressing dementia is that it exacerbates the existing generational divide that we face? In other words, my generation was incredibly fortunate in having cheap housing, free education, blah blah blah, and my children's generation much less fortunate in facing expensive housing, paid for education, all that stuff. So, and now we're looking at societies which are aging rapidly, where large amounts of resources are directed towards older people, when younger people are struggling themselves for their fair share. I'm just curious about whether that
It's a great question. We are running out of time. So while you think about your answer to that, I also promised that I would ask you before we run out of time we don't have time for the whole, to address it comprehensively, but for your answer to the question, what should the government strategy be, given that they haven't published it as they promised, and if chasing cure over care is too binary, what is the balance? Because from the discussion that we've had, I suspect, and the advantages that you have said flow from good care, early care, I suspect we might be chasing cure over care, unless the big point is it's not a zero-sum game. Anyway, do please address, I want to give each of you a chance to address both those challenges. This one and
So
mine.
very briefly, this goes around my head a lot actually, and whether there is inherent ageism in what's here. I suppose what gives me hope is that what we see at Alzheimer's Society is generations of young people wanting to get involved, either through support or volunteering or running dementia cafes. So I think this sense of community is, really important when we talk about the vision for the future. Tony, did you want to come in on that one?
Only that if young people are thinking that in some way that divide is exacerbated by the fact that there are so many sick elderly people now who require investment. The reality is that if you go into a care home, you're going to be looked after by people who are very poorly trained, who are probably paid less than the people who are working in Tesco's and are so short-staffed they're in tears an awful lot of time, just as nurses are. So, if that is the case as far as Alzheimer's sufferers are concerned, we've just got the narrative wrong, I think.
What's your sort of headline advice for the government as it ponders its unpublished strategy?
It has to be a linked strategy. We cannot continue just talking about social care or just talking about the NHS. We've got to bridge that divide. And when you started talking about these local groups, I think that is very much part of it. I know there are experiments in Harrogate, in Liverpool, where that kind of thing is happening. There are problems, as always, with those kind of local initiatives. One of the problems is that you end up with a bit of kind of postcode lottery, don't you? Somebody in Harrogate is getting this really good treatment, someone in Leeds isn't, and the people in Harrogate are getting paid, 25% more than the people in Leeds. It's not an easy solution, but I do think it is the beginning of some kind of solution. And I'm repeating myself, but as far as professional care is concerned, in the same way that I remember so clearly in the 1970s, politicians suddenly recognised that teachers were really fine people doing a magnificent job. We've got to find a way whereby people understand that care workers are the same as that, and that they deserve a career structure, they deserve proper training, they deserve proper wages, they deserve to be honoured. And that would be a big step as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you.
So definitely all of that. But I think if you think about a strategy, it has to have a vision. And I think there's a vision that dementia no longer devastates lives. And that will start with, getting a diagnosis in a supportive way, having that seamless step into this post-diagnostic support, this navigation bit that we've talked about, but being able to get the drugs or the other treatments, some of which aren't pharmaceutical. They're going to be things like talking therapies and others. Being asked to take part in research in a way that you do routinely in cancer, but then being able to have that really tailored, personalised care in the community that you call home, with options as you get older or need different care there in time for you to make decisions with your loved ones. I think it's that kind of from the beginning right to the end. Ultimately, I think we can do that, and it isn't one over the other. It is tackling it on all fronts.
Brilliant, not brilliant, but a vision needed and a vision offered nonetheless. Thank you so much, both of you and everyone. And Kate Palmer in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to you, Kate, but she makes picks up on the point that the conversation about that needs to be held when somebody has a diagnosis requires societal change in the same way as we've sort of had it already in the cancer sphere. But until then, too many people, per Matt's point and others, are afflicted by stigma attached to the condition itself, stigma attached to moving people into homes. The word stigma came up a lot. I'll just close by thanking Tony for your point that care in the NHS and the social care system needs to be linked. Of course, it is in an umbrella. You know, they've merged the ministries, but I think everybody's experience, much greater than mine, is that at ground level that doesn't count for much yet. And Fiona, your mantra offered at the end, dementia no longer devastates lives, does have echoes of how we've come to think about cancer. We've obviously got a long way to go until we're at that point with dementia. But as you explained beautifully early on, the science is sort of nudging us in that direction, or so it seems. And I don't want to forget Tony's extremely practical list for the 1 million unpaid carers of asks. Get the same person every week, get a specific diagnosis, get respite, and have less bureaucracy. Overall, it's very clear that to get all this done requires a huge sort of diversion of resources. But you come back to this figure that you mentioned early on, that 25% of people in hospitals, even if that's wrong by 5%, even if it's wrong by 10%, if you can address that, you address the massive structural healthcare issues that affect us all. Anyway, thank you very much. I've invented 6 minutes, plucked them out of nowhere, but thank you all for staying with us. Thank you for those of you who've joined us online. And do join us again tomorrow night for a Tortoise Lates on words. Thank you.
Thanks for watching that video. There's plenty more over on our channel, so just click here to subscribe.